News in the country and in the political scene this morning. We're analyzing what is in the in tray for President Uhuru Kenyatta for the next 5 years. It is a make or break 5 years for the president. His last term in office, he'll be looking to leave a legacy in the country. But what must he do in these 5 times? Well, in these 5 years? Well, in studio for this conversation is political analyst Evans Wafula. We'll also be joined later on by political analyst Danstan Riziki, just to put more balance to a rather tilted conversation here. Many thanks for joining us in studio, Evans. So it's been 2 days since President Uhuru Kenyatta was sworn in, 2 days into office. But many are now talking about what is in the in tray for President Uhuru Kenyatta. Uniting the nation, he says, is on the top of the agenda. But what must he begin with?
I think emerging from a position of advantage as an incumbent, I think Uhuru Kenyatta might be 3 or 4 single most issues that he must tackle. One is national cohesion. I think Kenya is a divided country. He really needs to come out clearly and be able to tell Kenyans how he intends to unite the country.
Right.
And that's what you see the same message coming from international partners, the US and the UK, realizing that we are a polarized country. The other thing is the issue of tackling corruption. I think corruption has been also a very big threat to democracy. And I think for him to be able to assert the fundamentals of democracy, he really needs to, first of all, deal with corruption. The other thing that is very, very fundamental is the economy. He needs to improve the economy. But that one starts with creating job opportunities for the young people. If he doesn't do that, then his legacy is very much going to be challenged.
Right, right. And let's talk about some of the things you've mentioned. I mean, corruption, the economy. Let's focus on corruption because the reports of corruption in the last 5 years or in his first term were what some would say the worst we've seen in the country since the beginning of independence. But without an opposition in place, so to speak, because it is rather unclear what the place of the opposition is right now, then that means that there is a gap in terms of checks and balances moving forward in his administration. What does that mean for him in fighting corruption? I
think in a situation where the corruption appears to have been institutionalized, that almost in every government department there's an element of corruption, then it also becomes difficult for the opposition to be able to offer that oversight. So I think what has happened, and I think where the president has really succeeded, he has really succeeded to institutionalize corruption. If you look at, you will virtually not talk about any state department that does not have the footprints of corruption. Right. Look at what happened in NYS. And it's really very disheartening to see the president during that time coming up and saying, what can I do? I'm not able to do anything. But also goes down to the institutions that have been created to deal with this kind of problems. The ESEC is quite unable to do what it's supposed to do. And that's one of the things he really needs to see. How do I then reform or try to strengthen the ESEC so that I'm able to deal with corruption at the institutional level? Because you see, when corruption is part of government, when people in government are the ones involved in corruption, it becomes very difficult, even anybody outside opposition, to oversight what the government is doing in terms of that. So I think the president this time really he has nothing to lose. He doesn't want any votes in 2022. I think what he really needs to do, there must be people who must be used as an example. He really needs to crack the whip. All
right. And of course, even before we speak about what he's going to achieve in the next 5 years, it's important to also go back and take a look at whether he has achieved what he promised to achieve back in 2013. Another some of that will be spilling over into this new term. And one of the things was strengthening devolution, really, which continues progressing. But like you mentioned, it becomes hard even for the devolved governments to carry out checks and balances with that institutionalization of corruption. But we've heard from the opposition some very startling statements saying they are forming the People's Assemblies to protect their opposition-leaning county governments from lack of equity from the national government. How hard is that task? How big is that task for the president to unite the opposition in terms of the devolved governments?
I think what's important is that the makers of the Constitution, realizing that we had an imperial sort of presidency, they really came up with this idea of having devolved governments. And if you look at, they're almost cut in the middle between the government and the opposition. I think what needs to do is that, and you see there's been a problem that the government has so much money than what they're giving to the, to the devolved government. That's about 15% going to the devolved government. I think that's where the president needs to start from. If he is able to sit down with the county governments and be able to say, okay, we are going to listen to you and see how we are going to distribute or equitable distribution of resources to the county government. I think all these county governments, I think the main problem is not been the political problem. It's been about how do we then compete or share resources with the national government. I think the problem has to, the president has to open the pass, the national pass, and be able to share the resources with the county governments or the devolved system so that they're able to, because the single most thing is not political power, but it's also creating opportunities and involvement and being able to assert or improve the economy at the county levels. So if he's not able to do that, then politics plays in. That's when you see now devolved governments that are leaning towards the opposition, looking at it that we have a political agenda. But the ultimate success of that political agenda is whether we will be able to bring the resources back to our people. And I think that's the simple message they are taking to people. They're talking about things like being marginalized. I mean, where they feel that there's not been inclusion. So I think the president has to demonstrate inclusion, but that begins with him being able to open that national pass and be able to share these resources down to the county government.
It was a notion initially that among the factors towards equitable sharing of these resources, or the perception of it, so to speak, is having cabinet secretaries who are not necessarily politicians, who don't have a history of political inclination. But the reports we have now indicate that the cabinet reshuffle to follow may have a major shake-up, having more cabinet secretaries who are politicians, so to speak. In terms of managing corruption in these major ministries, something that is likely to trickle down to the counties as well, is it a right move for the president to go? I
think it will have no impact. I think what I think he's trying to do is now, you know, when the president was campaigning, he promised people a lot of jobs.
Right.
He promised some, and I think what he's just trying to cut those departments into to reduce those departments and make those departments ministries. And look at what happened in the agriculture and water, where it was once together, then it was divided. I mean, national environment and water, where now you see two people sharing a ministry, which means a department is reduced into a ministry. So I think that will not have an impact. I think a leaner cabinet is good for the country, not a bigger for political expedience. So what the president is doing is trying to reward people. And I think it's dangerous for his legacy, because it doesn't matter how many cabinet positions you create to appease or to award people, but it's how the impact, how effective will they be able to. I think it's so little time for him now to be able to try to appease people by creating a cabinet position, and that will not tackle corruption. There are people who think now that since they have political leverage because of the campaigns and now that the president has been sworn in, they need to be rewarded, and they're going to use that for their own interests.
Right.
I think because now Uhuru Kenyatta's term is a term, it's legacy term. It's not a term that he has anything to lose anyway with anybody. I think he has to finish he has to build and make sure that he leaves his legacy intact.
So what legacy would you say he's looking to leave?
I think what President Uhuru Kenyatta wants to do is that he wants to, first of all, demystify the presidency. Not that the presidency to appear that it belongs to a certain community or to a certain people. And his message has always been clear that he is the president of every Kenyan. And that's the single most task that he has. He has to demonstrate that he's a president of everybody, whether those who voted for him or not. And I think the fundamentals of democracy that he really needs to ensure that he lives intact. You know, President Kenyatta is so very much connected to the new constitutional dispensation. So he really needs to prove that he's one of those people who really fought for this constitution. And that's where his legacy will lean. It's not going to be whether he has been able to walk this journey with the deputy president, and then the legacy becomes that I promise I will hand over power to the deputy, and that's what I will do. No, that's not the case. The case here is that he really needs to be the defender of democracy and the defender of the constitution. And his legacy will very much depend on whether he will leave this constitution. Look at what is happening now. The constitution has actually been suspended in a way, looking from what even the police are doing. Yeah, so I think the president has a single most task to ensure that he defends the constitution and he leaves a legacy that he's one of the people who actually put in place the critical fundamentals of a democratic country.
And just before we move on to matters development, of course, with the politics playing in the country, we've seen a lot of from the opposition saying they want the ICC to come back and investigate the cases of police brutality that have been meted out against Kenyans. Just today, several families will be picking the bodies of their loved ones from the city mortuary. But what outlook does that have on President Kenyatta's legacy so far, considering his ICC background?
I think the president is executive. Looking at what the conduct of the police are undermining and trying to they're actually undermining democracy. Looking the role of the police in a democratic system should be very clear. This is a police service that just has to ensure that it helps even the entire country to work through a democratic dispensation. But looking at the conduct of the police undermines even the goodwill of the president or even the government. I think I've always said that the way the police behave, they think that they're trying to help the government, but they don't know that they're trying also to undermine the democratic process, because people are free to demonstrate and to do all these kind of things they're doing, but the police also know the law is so clear on how they are supposed to conduct themselves in such situations. But the number of deaths that have occurred. I don't think President Kenyatta wants to be a president who is associated by ascending to power through kind of the things we are seeing, that people had to lose their life for you to assert yourself to a position of presidency. So I think the president also needs to be to rein in and to actually ensure that the principles of democracy does not only mean that people vote and then elect a president. There are many other things that affirms that the whole entire process is democratic. Leave alone what happened with the IBC. The conduct of the police is very critical to the democratic process, and that is now where I think the president has to put the focus. I don't think the life of any single Kenyan is good for the nation. And I think the president really needs to come out and condemn these killings and be able actually to pass a message to the Kenyans that I don't think anybody has to lose their life in a political contest. And I think the police also need to come clear and ensure that all those policemen who are implicated are punished. I think we need to be an open society. We need to be a society that have actually journeyed all through to where we are. And I've always told people that look at the conduct of our election. We emerged from where we could only vote by acclamation to where we could actually cast ballots, and which is critical to a democratic process. But I think the conduct of the police is very important, and I think people really need to focus on how that can undermine democracy.
All right. Is President Uhuru Kenyatta a man who's likely to have any major shake-up in the next 5 years? Because there's been a lot of conversations of a constitutional amendment to better accommodate the opposition, perhaps through extending the executive, perhaps through making more positions in Parliament within the National Assembly or the Senate. Is this a man who could lead the country to such a direction, one that takes us away from this every 5-year election cycle, one winner takes all, loser loses everything, and then we get back into this chaos once again? I
think Kenyans have witnessed the different styles of presidency, and this is a style of leadership, looking from Moi's style, where he was being perceived as a man with an iron fist man and could do anything with impunity. Then to Kibaki, where people looked at Kibaki and said that he's an hands-off president. He let you do your work and just like want to see the results. And then we have a situation where we have a president who many people in many quarters think that he has really lost control and probably giving credit to the deputy. And actually, if you work with everybody, and many people in many quarters will actually say the deputy is behind almost everything the president is doing. So I think the president really needs to prove to people, no, I'm a man of my own. I'm able to run this country on my own and that's the problem with coalition governments. And I think Jubilee is a coalition government. Whatever name they want to call it, they are power sharing. They're sharing power in a very smart way. And I think one person is above the other. And they have held each other at ransom. And that's why you see the president, I think, he will not be able to do much without the deputy president. And therefore, his legacy very much also depends on what goodwill he receives from the deputy president. And they cannot divorce that. And that's the single most challenge that the President Uhuru Kenyatta has. I think he would love to be remembered as a person who would even, for example, take a simple thing like dialogue, where people think that they're divided between the president's will to dialogue and the deputy president's will to have a stand. I mean, like, he's a man who just doesn't want to be shaken. So I think there must be a compromise. And Uhuru's legacy depends on himself and how he conducts himself, not on how he has shared power or how he's in a coalition with the deputy president.
Right.
So I think it's very critical for President Uhuru to know that he is not held ransom to deliver the presidency to the deputy president in 2022, but he has to make sure that he leaves his legacy. So he has to choose what his legacy will be. But you see, politically speaking, is that you'll find he just want to ensure that you supported me, I will also support you,
right,
and leave the power to
because
me.
there's been a lot of talk about 2022 politics already shaping up and playing out just 2 days after his swearing in. Is that something that's likely to affect perhaps his goodwill to implement some of what he wishes to implement?
Definitely, Michelle. You see, for example, now, you see, there's already people who have clearly made it clear to the president that they will not support the deputy president. And these are people who the president expects them to be among the people who will help him propel the deputy president to the presidency. That will definitely affect it. We are going to witness a lot of political realignment, even within Jubilee. I'll give you, in less than 1 year, you'll see many people shifting and making it clear to the deputy president that he will not ascend to power. Because at the end of the day is that it's one man, one vote. And if you owed Uhuru Kenyatta your votes, he will vote for you. There's no problem for the president to vote for the deputy president. But the deputy president will not have a guarantee that he will be voted by entirely everybody who is behind President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Right.
And that's one thing he has to know, because this is a political chessboard. And he knows very well that political alignments only surface at some point towards elections. So how he will hold that up to 2022 is also a big problem for the president, because I know many people in central Kenya, where the deputy president expects to get more votes, have already made it clear that once we get into power, the president has been sworn in, then let everybody be able to put his political machinery intact.
And of course, with the opposition coming in, the political climate isn't as stable as should be for a country that has been termed the East African powerhouse. What about matters development in terms of President Uhuru's agenda in restoring Kenya's image back to where it was? I mean, within the East African community, our position seems to have gone down drastically. Look at our neighbors, Tanzania and Uganda. After the notification, there was a huge blow to the country's economy. Basing it on Vision 2030, what must the president do to restore Kenya's image?
I think we need to have a clear foreign policy. And we need also to know how do we operate and relate with our international partners. The problem here is that our foreign policy has always been dictated or determined by a political leaning. So if you support the government politically, then you will do business with the government. If you don't support the government politically, you will not do business with the government. I think we really need to go to the drawing board, define our foreign policy, be able to understand how do we relate with, for example, now anybody will tell you we don't need then to have any representatives in Tanzania. We've completely lost Tanzania. I mean, there's no even point of having an ambassador there, because it doesn't serve anything to us. So I think at the end of the day, the president really needs to come clearly, decide that am I going to have change of tactic and policy when I deal with our international partners, and divorce trade and development from politics. I think we are all members of the East African community. I think we depend on each other, but it becomes absurd when you see that things that are happening here is that we sort of also don't have control. And there's also doublespeak. You find people in government also do not actually understand probably the foreign policy and what really needs to be done. Because you'll find the Minister for Foreign Affairs speaking one thing, you'll find a representative of government from another quarter speaking something different, and then entirely you find the president speaking against something different. So I think what is important is that we really need to know, because Uganda and Tanzania are one of our major trading partners. For us to lose them, there's a direct impact on the livelihood of many Kenyans. There are many Kenyans who are working in Tanzania. There are many Tanzanians who are doing business across the border almost every day. For these people to lose their livelihood, there's no way you can say then you have a development agenda when already other people are losing already their livelihoods.
And of course, it's not just the political situation, but the overall governance in the country that is affecting the economy and matters development. Because I understand as we speak, many of our major donors as a country have significantly reduced the amount of aid they're sending to the country, and something that is stalling major projects like the HIV prevention program. But part of the reason why they've reduced their funds is mismanagement of these funds and corruption, so to speak. There was a proposal during the campaign period, largely from the opposition, that when they get into power, if they get into power, they will pass a legislation ensuring that no government official can conduct any business with the government in a bid to curtail this corruption and leaving this wealth to only a few in the country. Is this something you would see as a good solution or a beginning to some of this mismanagement of funds?
Michelle, we have that in place. We've not lacked whatever I would call systems and institutions that can be able to assist us to prosper economically. If, for example, you remember the story about wealth declaration, where every state official had to declare their wealth. Some of them, and even when you go deep into police vetting, when you see the kind of the way the vetting is being conducted, ensuring that some police officers who are actually civil servants should not be able to make income outside their official time, or maybe people have been found with over millions of shillings in their M-Pesa bill. So I think there's been a lot of that goodwill to curb that. But the problem is that once corruption has been institutionalized, and I've said that it's become part and parcel of government. Right. I think it's an official, it is somehow appearing like an official government policy that if you are in a position of power within a government ministry, you should be able to see how then can you also make money. And then also look at the international community, looking openly how we're dealing with corruption. Look at what happened in NYS, the Minister of Health, about the containers. I mean, where are those containers till now? Who has actually been held accountable for that? So you'll find some of these things are being done with impunity. Donors who are supporting us could see, and they are seeing that people, it is only in Kenya, I've always said that it's only in Kenya that in the 21st century, there are people who are going to school without shoes. And you're talking about putting electricity in people's houses, and kids are going to school without shoes. The kids who cannot even have a meal in school. So I think these are some of the critical things that the government really needs to do. It's not about how many houses you're lighting, but how many kids can get to school and get quality education and get a meal back from home, back to their homes. I think those are the most critical things, because if you put electricity in a house where a child cannot even afford to go to school, you're not helping anybody. There's no any direct economic impact to that family where they can't even afford a meal. So the government look at, because I remember they came up with a plan that they're going to have school feeding programs. All these things have been hijacked by cartels. They have collapsed. They're putting electricity in schools. When you have a blackout, you'll have your power back after 2 months.
Free secondary, subsidized secondary education.
And it's not about free, but it's also the quality of education. You cannot subsidize education when you're still having problems with teachers who are not paid well.
Right.
So you're not paying teachers, but you're telling teachers, wait a minute, I'm going to pay school fees for every child. I think you're not motivating teachers. I cannot come to a class to teach where the government is paying for you to come to class, but it's not paying me to teach. So I think they really need to look at it, not to because parents don't want kids to go to school because the government can pay for them to go to school. They want them to go to school because they can get quality education.
Right.
And because the teachers are actually operating. And if you want to know how our education is actually almost on the knees, look at the inside a Kenyan classroom. I mean, if you look at during election and you see where most of our leaders are voting from, some of those classes are not in the 21st century. I mean, desks are broken, schools that don't have windows, and that's the pride of our education.
Right.
That is where our kids are going to school. You want to be a senator, you want to be a member of parliament, you want to be the president. Even look at where the president voted from. It's not a classroom that you can actually say his government has been trying to support.
And the state of our schools really came to fore during the voting day, of course, seeing the condition of many of the classrooms. But even as we wind up, let's talk accountability, because at the end of the day, somebody needs to be able to hold the government accountable to what it's doing, what it's not doing, what it promised it would do. How in your view, was the quality of accountability in his first term, and how is it likely to be, or should it improve in his second term?
For me, generally, I would say President Kenyatta, when he came to power, he came with a goodwill. He came with a lot of expectation. I think many young people who resonated very well with him thought that this is a digital government, is a government that is going to make us actually compete with even somebody in the United States, in the UK. We're going to be somewhere. But then corruption checked in, cartels checked in. People looked at it. And I think there are people who have deliberately tried to frustrate President Uhuru's legacy. I'm not speaking for him. But as much as he's been trying, there are people who are out to ensure that his legacy is dented. Right. And it's actually going towards that. Because you look at what happened in NYS. You cannot, for heaven's sake, loot a state parastatal, and the following day, you're becoming... I'm not saying everybody does not have a right to participate in any democratic process, but you should be vetted before you come from a parastatal that is collapsing because of your mismanagement to going to manage a county.
And of course, there are some of the questions that are being asked with that governance, but it is a conversation for another day, Evans. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this conversation. Many thanks for joining us on KTN News Center. Evans Wafula is a media consultant and a political analyst here. We're discussing President Uhuru Kenyatta's next 5 years and what he must do. You're watching KTN News Center. We'll take a short commercial break. Do stay with us. So much more still to come.